The war that wasn't what we were told. History feels solid, fixed, finished. We grow up believing that the past is locked in place, neatly labeled in textbooks, dates memorized, heroes chosen, villains assigned. We're taught that wars are simple stories with clear sides, clear causes, and clear endings. But every once in a while, when you slow down and actually look at the evidence, history begins to feel unstable. Imagine walking into a government office today and seeing a portrait of America's greatest enemy hanging proudly on the wall. Not in a museum, not in a historical exhibit, but in a place of honor. You'd assume it was a mistake, or a joke, or maybe something deeply wrong. Because enemies don't celebrate each other. Victors don't decorate their halls with the symbols of the defeated. Now hold on to that feeling, because that same kind of contradiction sits quietly at the heart of one of the most famous wars in history, the year 1812. We're told it was simple. Napoleon invaded Russia. The Russian people rose up. Moscow burned. Winter arrived. The French army was crushed. End of story. A patriotic legend repeated for over 2 centuries. But when you strip away the textbook language and start asking uncomfortable questions, that story begins to fall apart. Let's start with the most basic assumption of all. Who was actually fighting whom? Napoleon Bonaparte is remembered as a man obsessed with power, control, and strategic dominance. He was ruthless, methodical, and brutally logical. When he wanted to destroy an enemy state, he went for its political heart. He did this again and again across Europe. Capitals fell, governments collapsed, kings fled. So here's the first crack in the official narrative. In 1812, the political capital of the Russian Empire was not Moscow, it was St. Petersburg. That was where the emperor lived. That was where laws were written, orders were signed, and the empire was administered. It was closer to Europe, closer to Napoleon's supply lines, and far more vulnerable. Yet Napoleon ignored it completely. Instead of striking the head, he marched his massive army hundreds of miles east, deep into the continent, toward Moscow, an old city, a merchant center, officially no longer the capital, no longer the seat of power. That decision alone should stop you in your tracks, because it makes no sense unless Moscow was not what we've been told it was. What if Moscow wasn't just a symbolic city? What if it wasn't merely cultural or religious? What if Moscow was the real center of power for something much older, much larger, and much more dangerous to European ambitions? When historians defend Napoleon's decision, they usually fall back on psychology. They say Moscow represented Russia's soul, that capturing it would break morale, that it was a symbolic victory. But Napoleon did not build an empire on symbolism. He built it on logistics, intelligence, and cold calculation. And here's where the paper trail gets strange. When researchers began examining Napoleon's personal correspondence, military orders, and internal documents, they expected to find Russia described clearly and consistently as the main enemy. Instead, they found something else entirely: a silence. Russia, as a political enemy, appears oddly absent. Instead, European maps and documents from that era repeatedly reference unfamiliar names: Muscovy, Great Tartary, Asian hordes, Eastern domains. These weren't obscure footnotes. They appeared on official maps, in atlases, in geographic encyclopedias used by scholars, merchants, and military planners. It creates an unsettling impression, as if Napoleon's army wasn't marching against the state we now call Russia, but against something else, something that no longer officially exists. And if that sounds impossible, consider this. Napoleon waited on the hills overlooking Moscow, expecting a delegation to arrive with the keys to the city. That's the story we're told, a dramatic moment, the conqueror waiting for surrender. But the people he expected were called boyars. There's just one problem. The boyar class was officially abolished more than a century earlier by Peter the Great, By 1812, boyars were a thing of the distant past. Expecting them to appear would be like expecting medieval knights to show up at a modern peace summit. So how did Napoleon's intelligence get this so catastrophically wrong? Either French intelligence completely failed to understand the society they were invading, which would be shocking given Napoleon's reputation, or those boyars still existed in some form, belonging to a political system that official history insists had already vanished. And the contradictions don't stop there. We're told Moscow burned because it was a wooden city, a simple explanation, easy to remember, easy to teach children. But by 1812, building wooden houses in central Moscow had been banned for decades. The heart of the city was stone and brick. This wasn't medieval London. Stone cities don't vanish overnight from accidental fires. Yet eyewitness accounts describe something far worse than fire. French officers recorded scenes that terrified even hardened veterans. They didn't describe flames creeping from building to building. They described stone walls collapsing, structures exploding from within, bright flashes, thunderous shocks. One officer wrote about watching entire buildings disintegrate, leaving nothing but dust and shattered foundations. Another described fireballs descending from the sky, striking specific locations as if guided. This wasn't chaos, it sounded targeted. And then there's the death toll. In earlier fires, when Moscow truly was wooden, casualties were surprisingly low. People ran, they escaped. Fires moved slowly enough for human beings to survive. But in 1812, roughly 30,000 soldiers died inside the city. 30,000 trained, mobile men. How did that many people burn to death in a stone city they could have simply walked out of? You don't need to be a historian to feel that something is wrong here. The destruction behaved less like fire and more like a sudden, overwhelming force, something inescapable, something instantaneous. And after the city was destroyed, another strange thing happened. Relentless rain fell over the ruins. Survivors, French and Russian alike, wandered through the ashes in shock. Many reported sudden illness, weakness, confusion. Symptoms that modern medicine might associate with poisoning or radiation exposure. Yet no one benefited from this catastrophe. Not France, not Russia. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If neither side gained from the destruction of Moscow, then who did? As the armies regrouped, something even stranger became apparent. The two sides were nearly indistinguishable. Russian peasants frequently attacked their own soldiers by mistake, confusing them for French troops. The uniforms were too similar, the cuts, the colors, the insignia. One famous Russian partisan leader admitted his men had to abandon their uniforms entirely and dress like peasants just to survive among their own people. Think about that. In a supposed war of national survival, the population couldn't tell friend from enemy. And it gets worse. High-level correspondence suggests that uniform styles may have been deliberately standardized. Two supposedly mortal enemies agreeing to dress their armies alike. That doesn't look like total war. It looks like coordination. Even the language of power betrays the story. Official Russian documents from the war were written in French. Decrees, manifestos, celebratory publications. All in the language of the so-called invader. Imagine a modern government announcing victory over its greatest enemy using the enemy's language exclusively. The absurdity is obvious. But in 1812, we're told this was normal. And then there are the monuments. Stone and bronze don't lie easily. Monuments to Russian commanders are topped not with Russia's double-headed eagle, but with the single-headed eagle of Napoleon's empire. Approved at the highest levels, repeated across multiple locations. This wasn't a mistake. Symbols matter, especially in empires. Which brings us to a darker possibility. What if 1812 was not a war between France and Russia at all? What if it was a joint operation? a coordinated effort by European powers and the Western-oriented Russian elite to destroy something older, larger, and fundamentally incompatible with their vision of the world? Old maps offer a clue. Before the 19th century, vast portions of Eurasia were labeled with a name that has all but vanished from modern memory: Great Tartary. A massive territory stretching from the Urals to the Pacific, from the Arctic to the edges of India, a civilization with its own elites, traditions, and power centers, one of which appears to have been Moscow. If that civilization existed, then Napoleon's march makes sense. Moscow wasn't a symbolic target, it was the heart. And St. Petersburg? A Western outpost, a Romanov project, loyal to Europe. In that light, the burning of Moscow becomes something else entirely. Not collateral damage, not tragedy, but erasure. The civilization that had to disappear. If the War of 1812 was not what we were taught, then the next logical question is terrifyingly simple. What was really destroyed? History claims that beyond the borders of early 19th century Europe lay empty lands, scattered tribes, and loosely organized peoples waiting to be civilized. But history, as written by winners, has a habit of turning conquered empires into footnotes and erased civilizations into myths. Yet maps do not lie easily. If you open European atlases printed before the mid-1800s, something jumps out immediately. Across the heart of Eurasia, where modern textbooks show blank space or future imperial claims, there is a name written boldly, confidently, and repeatedly: Great Tartary. Not once, not twice, but across centuries, languages, and publishing houses. French maps, British maps, Dutch atlases, academic encyclopedias, all referencing a vast political entity stretching from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. This wasn't folklore. These were official documents used by navigators, diplomats, and military planners. So how did a civilization that large vanish so completely that modern students are never even told it existed? To understand that, we need to examine how power describes its enemies. Empires rarely admit they are destroying another empire. That would suggest parity, legitimacy, competition. Instead, they frame expansion as defense, chaos as order, conquest as liberation. And that is exactly how the story of 1812 was later packaged. But the cracks appear when we look at symbolism. Wars leave scars in stone and metal. Medals are minted, monuments are raised, victories are immortalized. And those objects often survive long after paper documents are rewritten or quietly discarded. When historians began to study medals struck after the War of 1812, they noticed something deeply unsettling. Scenes of battle were depicted not with contemporary soldiers, but with figures wearing ancient Roman armor. Helmets, shields, tunics straight out of classical antiquity. At first glance, this is dismissed as artistic tradition. Neoclassicism was fashionable after all. But that explanation collapses when you notice something else. Many of these scenes show not two opposing sides, but three figures. Three warriors, three forces. If France and Russia were the only participants, who was the third? This symbolism appears again and again, on medals, on engravings, on reliefs carved into stone. And then there are the churches. Medals commemorating the capture of Moscow depict church domes not crowned with Orthodox crosses, but with unfamiliar symbols. Solar signs, pagan shapes, imagery inconsistent with Russian Christianity. That detail alone suggests that what was destroyed was not simply a city, but a religious and cultural system that did not fit neatly into Romanov orthodoxy or Catholic Europe. The more you look, the clearer the pattern becomes. This was not a war of nations. It was a war of systems. One system was Western, centralized, bureaucratic, and increasingly industrial. It spoke French in court, dressed its armies alike, and borrowed legitimacy from Roman and imperial symbolism. The other system was older, decentralized, rooted in traditions that European elites viewed as backward, dangerous, or uncontrollable. That system needed to disappear, and its capital appears to have been Moscow. This reframes one of the most disturbing aspects of 1812, the behavior of the population. We're told the Russian people rose up in patriotic unity, that peasants burned their own city to deny Napoleon shelter. But historical records quietly mention something else. That year, at least 67 major peasant uprisings erupted across the region. And they weren't crushed by the French. They were crushed by troops loyal to Alexander I. Why would a population supposedly fighting for survival rebel against its own emperor during a patriotic war? Unless they didn't see him as their emperor at all. Unless they saw both armies, French and Imperial Russian, as occupiers. This would explain why peasants attacked soldiers indiscriminately, why uniforms caused confusion, why loyalty seemed fractured and chaotic. From this perspective, 1812 looks less like a foreign invasion and more like the final stage of a long internal conquest, a civilizational purge. And now we arrive at one of the most chilling questions of all. Why was Moscow destroyed so completely? Not occupied, not governed, not rebuilt immediately, but annihilated. If Napoleon and Alexander were enemies, Moscow should have been a bargaining chip, a prize, a hostage city. Instead, it became a grave. Eyewitness accounts describe destruction that went beyond fire. Stone collapsing, buildings exploding, shockwaves rippling through streets. This wasn't how cities were normally captured. This was how threats were erased. And afterward, nature itself seemed to react. Endless rain, illness, disorientation, a population wandering through ruins as if something invisible had poisoned the land. Even the armies stopped behaving like enemies. French and Russian soldiers shared fires, shared shelter, shared silence. Witnesses described the mood not as triumph or defeat, but as horror, as if both sides understood they had crossed a line. Which leads us to the most disturbing implication of all. What if Napoleon was not the villain of this story, but the contractor? What if he was hired to do what the Romanov state could not openly do on its own? Destroy the old center, break the resistance, erase the memory. And once the task was complete, the financial trail would settle the account. Because war always leaves receipts. After 1812, logic would suggest that France, the defeated invader, should have paid reparations. Instead, something unprecedented happened. When Russian troops entered Paris, they behaved with remarkable restraint. No looting, no mass reprisals. Officers paid for meals with gold. And then came the final act. Before leaving France, the commander of the Russian occupation forces personally paid off all outstanding debts owed by his soldiers to French creditors. The amount was staggering, equivalent to tens of tons of silver. Let that sink in. The country whose ancient capital lay in ashes, the country that supposedly suffered invasion and devastation, paid massive sums of money to the defeated enemy. That is not how victory works, but it is exactly how final payment works. In business terms, it looks like closing a contract. If Moscow's treasures vanished during the destruction and never resurfaced in Paris or St. Petersburg, then where did they go? Into settling accounts, into rewarding partners, into financing a new world order. Britain's role suddenly makes sense as well. Subsidies flowed, alliances shifted, borders were redrawn. This was not chaos, It was coordination. By the mid-19th century, Great Tartary was gone. Its name erased from maps. Its people relabeled. Its history absorbed, fragmented, and reassigned. What remained was a clean narrative. France invaded, Russia resisted. Winter saved the day. A fairy tale simple enough to teach children, and powerful enough to hide the destruction of an entire civilization. But stone remembers. Symbols persist. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. Who writes history, and why you were never meant to know? Every empire eventually faces the same problem. Conquest is easy compared to memory. You can burn cities, you can kill armies, you can redraw borders, but memory survives in people, symbols, stories, and stone. And as long as memory exists, the past can rise again. That is why true conquest doesn't end with victory on the battlefield. It ends with rewriting history. If the destruction of Moscow in 1812 was the final blow against an ancient civilization, then what followed was just as important as the war itself, because once the smoke cleared, the real work began. Erasure. The first step was geography. Maps created before the 19th century openly displayed Great Tartary as a vast political entity, but maps created afterward changed quietly, gradually, and decisively. Borders shifted westward. Empty spaces appeared where names once stood. What had been labeled as a unified state was reclassified into wilderness, tribes, or future imperial territory. This wasn't announced. It didn't need to be. Maps are authority. People trust them instinctively. And when a generation grows up seeing the same shapes repeated in textbooks, atlases, and classrooms, those shapes become reality. The second step was language. Names matter. You can't erase a civilization if people still speak its name. Tartary slowly disappeared from official use. In its place came safer terms, regional labels, ethnic fragments, administrative divisions. What had once been a single civilizational space was broken into manageable pieces, each small enough to be controlled and explained away. The third step was identity. Populations associated with the old order were reclassified. Some were absorbed into new imperial identities. Others were labeled as auxiliaries, minorities, or traditional units serving the state. Their weapons were described as primitive, their clothing as exotic, their leaders as rebellious or backward. This reframing wasn't accidental. It transformed a defeated civilization into a collection of colorful footnotes. And then came the most powerful weapon of all: education. History textbooks are not neutral documents. They are political tools, written not to explore truth, but to stabilize the present. A story of joint conquest would have raised dangerous questions. A story of genocide would have demanded accountability. A story of alliance between supposed enemies would have shattered national myths. So a simpler narrative was created. Napoleon became the villain. Russia became the victim. Winter became the hero. It was clean, emotional, easy to remember. And most importantly, it erased the third party entirely. But here's the thing about lies told at scale. They require maintenance. Academia plays a crucial role in that maintenance. Modern historians are not evil conspirators. Most of them are sincere scholars working within rigid frameworks. But those frameworks have boundaries. Certain questions are discouraged. Certain topics are labeled fringe. Certain maps are dismissed as outdated curiosities. Funding matters. Reputation matters. Careers matter. And no academic institution is eager to reopen questions that challenge the legitimacy of modern states. Because if Great Tartary existed, then the foundation stories of multiple empires begin to wobble. Borders become negotiable. Legitimacy becomes questionable. History becomes unstable. That is why anomalies are explained away individually, never collectively. A strange monument is an artistic quirk. A Roman armored soldier is a stylistic choice. A missing territory is a cartographic error. A French language manifesto is cultural fashion. Each inconsistency is isolated, defanged, and buried under explanation. But when you line them all up, something terrifying emerges, a pattern. And patterns are dangerous because patterns suggest intent. Which brings us to the present. Why is this story resurfacing now? Because the modern world is experiencing the same forces that shaped 1812. Globalization, centralization, cultural standardization, erasure of inconvenient histories. Once again, we're told that the past is settled, that borders are final, that resistance is backward, that progress requires forgetting. But the internet changed something fundamental. For the first time, people can compare maps from different centuries in seconds. They can read memoirs ignored by mainstream narratives. They can notice symbols that were hiding in plain sight. And once people start noticing, control slips. The story of 1812 isn't just about Napoleon or Russia. It's a warning. It shows how easily civilizations can be erased, not only physically, but conceptually. How entire peoples can be removed from memory without a trace, replaced by a story that flatters the victors. It also explains why modern power structures are so obsessed with controlling narratives, because memory is resistance. If Great Tartary was real, then it proves that alternative systems once existed, that centralized imperial models are not inevitable, that history is not a straight line of progress, but a battlefield of ideas. And that realization is dangerous, because it means the world you live in is not the only possible one. The winners of history want you to believe that the present order is natural, permanent, and unquestionable, that nothing meaningful existed before it, that nothing meaningful can exist outside it. But history, when examined honestly, tells a different story. It tells us that empires rise not because they are right, but because they are ruthless. That truth survives not because it is protected, but because it refuses to die. And that every erased civilization leaves behind ghosts in stone, metal, and memory. The War of 1812 was not just a war, it was a reset. And the fact that you were never taught this version of events, it's not an accident. It's proof that the story still matters. So the next time you open a textbook, look at a monument, or glance at an old map, ask yourself a simple question. Who benefits from the version of history I'm being shown? Because the truth is rarely hidden, it's just buried under agreement. And once you start digging, there's no going back.